Aloha and good evening, everyone. My name is Jürgen Steinmetz, and I'm joining you from Livestream.travel and eTurbo News here in Honolulu, Hawaii. Uh, Today, we have participants from all over the world. We're celebrating actually the launch of World Tourism Network, what is the continuation of Rebuilding.travel, a discussion group we had since March of this year, right after COVID surprised ITB in Berlin and closed it. We had our first session in ITB because we went to Berlin anyway, and here we are many months later, the end of the year, and we're now ready to structure Rebuilding.travel into an initiative where everyone can have a part of it. We're building global chapters. We want to build this organization from the bottom up, and we have interest groups. And one of the interest groups we have is aviation. And aviation is led by Vijay Poonoosamy. He is joining us today, and he's leading actually this discussion tonight. Vijay was a former VP for Etihad Airways. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable people I know in the aviation industry, and he's joining us from Singapore tonight. And it's his discussion, it's his group, and he will introduce himself and his panel. Good evening, Vijay, or good afternoon for you.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Greetings to everyone, and welcome to WTN's Aviation Group's inaugural panel series entitled Plane Talk, for 60 minutes of candid discussions on the aviation challenges. And today, we will be dealing with COVID-19 and the environment. My name is Vijay Poonoosamy, and I invite you to fasten your seatbelts and welcome our panelists. Professor Geoffrey Lipman, President of SUNx Malta and former IATA Executive Director, UNWTO Assistant Secretary General, and First WTTC President. Ms. Adefunke Adeyemi, IATA's Regional Director, Advocacy and Strategic Relations, Africa, and Dr. Susan Becken, Professor of Sustainable Tourism at Griffith University in Australia, and a member of the Air New Zealand Sustainability Advisory Panel. I will offer some brief opening remarks before interacting with our distinguished panelists and address some of the questions you posed before giving some closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, airlines survived and thrived by being the arteries of an interconnected and thriving world, and by being the wings of booming global tourism and trade. In 2019, travel and tourism contributed, according to WTTC, to $8.9 trillion to global GDP and 330 million jobs worldwide. The airline industry's net profit in 2019 was $26.4 billion, and last December, IATA's 2020 forecast was that the global airline industry will produce a net profit of $29.3 billion and mark its 11th consecutive profitable year. Airlines invested billions in next generation aircraft and technology, in recruiting and training personnel to meet and stimulate an ever increasing demand for air travel. Sky was not the limit, as long-term projections predicted a doubling in air travel over the next 2 decades. Then came COVID-19. WTTC estimates that by the end of this year, more than 174 million travel and tourism jobs will be lost globally, and global GDP would lose more than $4.7 trillion from travel and tourism. Now, governments have so far supported the airlines with $173 billion, but IATA expects airlines to have debts in excess of $651 billion and lost $118.5 billion by the end of this year. Air cargo continues to do well because it is driven by need. Air passengers who need to travel, for example, to return home, for medical or family emergencies, for unavoidable business and pilgrimage, will do so as soon as they are able to. However, and this will be perhaps my first challenge to my panelists, even though it is safe to fly when airlines enforce updated health protocols, being on an aircraft is only a part of the journey. And I believe that the ongoing painful human and economic losses, the unpredictability of COVID-19 and its various waves, the risk of being infected or being in contact with someone who is, the tests and quarantines at both ends of a flight, the risk associated with a positive COVID test and treatment in a foreign country, the risk of a lockdown at either ends of a flight, the length of a flight, and the enhanced climate change awareness will impact people's desire and ability to indulge in discretionary air travel. Now, work-related travel will also be impacted for a long time because businesses continue to suffer, budgets everywhere are being slashed, and people, like all of us on this call, are embracing the convenience and new opportunities of the cost-effective virtual tools. It is therefore fair, and this is my first question to Funke, to say that the biggest hurdles in stimulating international air traffic continue to be border closures and quarantines.
Thank you very much, Vijay. It's a pleasure to be here on this inaugural aviation session of the WTN. It's a great question, Vijay, and really goes to the heart of the matter. Before the COVID-19 crisis, aviation carried 4.5 billion people around the world. That's half of the world's population. So in a manner of speaking, you could call aviation a form of mass transportation. It's basically like taking a bus. And then all of a sudden the pandemic came and it really deconnected the world in a way that we haven't seen, I think, since aviation came on stream in commercial quantities. So this really had a significant far-reaching impact in so many different ways. And I think we're now at the point where we're at a crux and at a pivotal point where we need to consider the balance of saving lives and the livelihoods of those lives. And that's really, I think, what is really happening at the moment. And certainly that's at the forefront of the consideration in Africa, led by the African Union and many of the institutions. But to the question specifically, for sure, this issue of border opening, based following on from the border closures resulting from the pandemic is absolutely fundamental. At the crux of this crisis, passenger numbers were down to 96%, meaning that there was hardly any flying going on. The only silver lining was the fact that cargo was moving, particularly moving PPEs and medicines around the world. And that was really important. And we were able to move, I think, about 46,000 tons of those kinds of much needed essential equipment around the world to really help countries fight the pandemic. We were also able to move about 5.4 million people in terms of repatriation, people needing to get back home and to their families, et cetera, and to their home countries where they live. But beyond that, nothing else was happening. And this really had such a deep impact on GDP and aviation's and travel and tourism's contribution to global GDP. You've given the numbers, but just to highlight to the participants that all of these parameters halved. In fact, in most cases, they went below half. So the contribution of GDP of aviation, particularly of 3.5 million, went down to 1.7 trillion, went down to 1.7 trillion. The impact in terms of the losses on jobs, 46 million. So reopening borders is absolutely critical. Now we understand the concerns from a public health perspective of governments in terms of confidence to reopen their borders, to ensure that aviation is not a vector to create or lead to the transmission of COVID-19 across international borders, as well as the issue of passenger confidence. As you said, people really think twice now about whether to take a trip. But here's the thing. Since this COVID-19, aviation, as is typical for our industry, have been quite proactive in looking at how best we can address this issue of confidence and to really take responsibility to make sure that the industry is not a spreader, a super spreader of this disease. The first things that we did were we started to proactively look at how we could assess the end-to-end journey of a passenger and their cargo, and how to make sure that that journey was as safe as possible. And we looked at everything from the pre-flight, even from before you left your house. So how could you mitigate, contact with unnecessary contact from that process, all the way to when you get either through transit or when you arrive at your destination to borders and customs. That's the first thing. So we looked at this sort of biosecurity measures, which was a layered approach, and really looked at, to ensure physical distancing, to ensure, the right public health safety precautions were being taken, and to ensure that all of the touch points along the passenger journey were addressing the issues they needed to properly. The second issue, and this was all done, as IATA guidance, but also under the umbrella of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, that really worked with all of the industry to come up with these measures. The second thing was that we also looked inward. That process of getting on the flight, what happens to a passenger in flight? And we worked with the aircraft manufacturers. We worked with, some research institutions, universities, and so on, really looking at what happens here, and discovered something quite interesting, that the cabin environment of an aircraft is actually safer than most enclosed spaces, even safer than a theater where someone is having open heart surgery. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that it's a total zero risk environment, but that's not the point of getting people moving left and right. There's no zero risk with COVID until an effective vaccine has been proven to work. There's no zero risk, but the point is to mitigate the risk as much as possible. So we looked at that element. And then the third was, we said, how can we use a risk-based approach to ensure that governments can open their borders to each other? So opening up travel corridors and opening up travel bubbles, looking at the risk of each country. So in a sense, if there's already community spread, and we know already from the research we've done that the risk of transmission from international travel, especially if the travel process is a safe process, then you can open your borders internationally. But we're seeing governments, a lot of governments are trying to take a zero risk approach, which is not helpful. So I just want to wrap up now with a few key points. We believe that testing, systematic testing prior to departure, is a great alternative to imposing quarantines or maintaining border closures. And the reason is that testing has been proven to at least showcase what are the who are the people who can go into the different streams. Whether you are positive, if you test positive before departure, you just don't get on that plane. So you mitigate the risk of being a spreader through that journey. If you don't, then you're home free. You go to your destination without the need to be quarantined, because you've gone through this process within that safe environment. Not just using the testing, but also the multi-layered approach we're talking about. And so it's absolutely fundamental that we're able to reopen borders on this basis. Some of the borders that have critical mass in the world in terms of aviation travel, North America, Europe, and to some extent Asia, have not yet opened their borders because of trying to take this zero risk approach. But there really is no zero risk, as I mentioned. COVID is still here. And while we have good news about the vaccine, it's really important for us to have this. And so it's a momentous time in our history, but it's going to take about 12 to 14 months until we see the efficacy. And of course, until we get global distribution to many destinations. And so in the meantime, testing is important and it's critical as a means to open borders. And we'd like to encourage and urge governments to really embrace this approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Funke. Very, very clear, very articulate, very compelling arguments you're making there. And let's try to debate them now. Geoffrey, you want to respond, comment, address any of the points which Funke so ably articulated just now? And I'll ask Susan to do the same in a minute. Geoffrey, if you unmute yourself, that would...
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Vijay, and thank you, Funke. I felt the arguments that Funke made were, and she made them very, very clearly and very, very well, were the arguments that I might have made myself if I were working for IATA once more. What Funke didn't deal with, and I think many of us involved in the industry who want to be positive about the future and want to advocate our position, we tend to gloss over some fundaments which come before the question. COVID-19 kills people. It doesn't just affect GDP, it could kill any one of us on this call. The opening and closure of borders is one of a mechanism that governments have put into place to deal with a global pandemic, a public health crisis in every country. And I'm not any expert on this, but we know, and you touched on it yourself, Vijay, this is a highly infectious virus. I sat on the UN Interagency Committee when I was in the UNWTO, when we dealt with avian flu. And all the agencies had a nominated contact point, and I was the contact point for UNWTO. And this has made me understand a little bit how complicated it is to get control of a new virus, and one where the medical profession, the best medical people in the world, the best, are actually uncertain as to how the virus will be contained and how it might mutate and how it might pass. And in those circumstances, as human beings, not as aviation or tourism advocates, we have to believe, I think, that precaution is the best course of action. And if precaution involves closing borders, because as you yourself said, Vijay, our industry is a vector for this disease. We are a potential super spreader. And yes, the interior of an aircraft may be very, very sterile. I think I prefer to have open heart surgery in a hospital myself, Funke, than on a 747 somewhere. But that being on one side, I think we have to step out of our skins as a first point. And we have to say that whatever governments do in order to control and stop this virus from spreading, including testing, including contact tracing, including a safe and well distributed and scaled vaccine, assume 2 years for that to get out around the world. Whatever they do, as a sector, we have to simply go along with it. Yes, we'd like it to be nice bubbles, nice corridors, safe transit through airports. It's going to take some time to put all that in place. And in the meantime, the virus is doing things which the medical people are only learning about as it does things. So I don't want to sort of go on with a prepared speech. I think we have to do what the health authorities tell us, and we have to hunker down and accept that for the next 2 to 3 years, it's like having a conversation at the beginning of the 1939-1945 war and getting some people together who say, it's going to be great when we can go out again in the evenings and go to restaurants and not go into bunkers because the bombs are dropping. At this moment, we are in 1940. And there's another 4 or 5 years of that war, and people didn't like it. And GDP dropped, and jobs dropped, and industry sectors like aviation had to readjust and go back into a sort of basic operation and do all those things that Funke talked about. Work with ICAO, plan mechanisms for safe passage, make sure that all the messaging is right. But the point is, the virus is the issue. We have to control it. Otherwise, you, Vijay, or Funke, or me, could be dead because we go to the wrong place at the wrong time.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Susan, you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, I might. I mean, it's a great discussion, and I'm just sort of sitting here wondering. I mean, it depends on the perspective you take and what we're trying to save. Is it the aviation industry? Is it lives? Is it countries' economies? Is it a long-term future for travel? So it depends a little bit. And I might just briefly share a few thoughts from New Zealand, because we are probably one of those countries. I mean, we've locked the borders, and so has Australia. And you mentioned earlier, Vijay, this idea of discretionary air travel. And what I find really interesting, and in fact, the whole country here has established a Tourism Futures Task Force, and Air New Zealand is involved in the discussions that really looks at what's the future we want. The question then is, we had a lot of problems before COVID, over tourism. There's now modeling being done to see was this actually the right level for the size of the country, because we didn't have enough workforce to serve tourists, etc. So we've been closed since March. Consumer expenditure has actually gone up since then. It has more than compensated the loss of international travelers, and that's the interesting thing. The question is, how many people, and that's how you started, Vijay, how many people see international travel as essential from now on? People are reconnecting with the country. People are interestingly actually investing into holiday homes, which I think that's an interesting long-term trend, because you don't just buy a holiday home and then you sell it again. So people are almost shifting their mindset towards a little bit closer to home travel. And the same happens in Australia. So once the economy is open again, I will be interested to see how much traffic will there be across the Tasman Sea, which is obviously, it's a really busy corridor, lots of competition. But how many people will have essential travel? And there's lots of them. And you see it, we had a few flights going over, and people really happy to be reunited. Business, I myself have my office actually on the Gold Coast, and I'm sitting here. So I will definitely go, no matter what it costs. But how much discretionary travel is there that will be not happening for all the reasons that you said, plus people have shifted their behaviors. And I think that's what the airlines might have to grapple with, that there will be a contraction in demand, because people might have changed their views on what's actually really important travel and what's not. And there's implications, and they are not always bad for the economies that are concerned. There will be some that I think will be missing out. Island states, for example, we need to look after, but not all countries will necessarily be negatively affected.
Thank you, Susan. Funke, you've basically heard two very interesting perspectives and concerns going forward.
Yes.
Can I ask you to maybe respond or give us your honest reaction to these concerns?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll start with what Susan just said. You know, this idea that consumer behavior really will impact what the recovery for our industry will look like, whether for aviation alone or for the wider travel and tourism, as well as what countries are doing from taking into account the learnings that they have seen as a result of the COVID-19. So that's a very valid point. And in fact, we're forecasting that for the aviation industry, we won't see a meaningful or proper recovery to 2019 levels until, as late as 2024. So that's really something that's definitely going to impact and contract demand over the short term, over the next sort of 3-year horizon. Now, to what Prof. Geoffrey said, absolutely right. I mean, this is not something that we take lightly at all. The coronavirus is killing people, and the industry is being responsible with this very, very real reality facing us in terms of what we're doing. And that's why we are working not just with ICAO, but with the WHO. We've worked hand in hand with them on a joint task force to really see how we can address these concerns. So it's not a question of, one side against the other. It's a question of really taking a collaborative approach to address certain issues. And the WHO has said, while you're right that the way that the behavior of the virus is still evolving, and medical science is still learning about its behaviors and how it transmits, its mutations, etc. The WHO is also being clear-minded about certain issues. For example, the WHO does not recommend quarantine. And that's a very interesting point. So, we have the extreme of border closures. And of course, these are decisions that are also not taken lightly by governments, because they also understand the impact. But then you have, where travel is permitted, people are still being quarantined, even though they have proof that they have taken a negative, they've tested negative to it, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it is also a disincentive to those who will travel. They won't travel. We've done a survey, on passengers. Will you travel if you're tested? 88% say yes. Will you travel if you're likely to be quarantined on the other side? As high as 80% say no. So a quarantine, if you've been tested, is another disincentive to travel. And that's the area that we're really trying to address here, that if you are open, first of all, you can open if you really look at the risk and calculate it based on what you think is best for your people and your country, then open up based on testing, contact tracing, and so on, and all of the other multi-layered measures. And if you do open up and you do test before departure, then don't quarantine on the other side, because you just simply will not get the people coming. Unless I'm going home, I'm not going to go to any place where I have to isolate or quarantine for 7 days or 14 days. There just simply would be no reason to. So that's really what we're trying to address here. And we're also trying to use, not just to ensure that there is a trusted framework that is really the forefront of the center of this issue. One of the reasons why governments are closing their borders to other countries is, well, there is a trust issue, and we've got to be frank here. Do we trust the tests that are coming from country X? Do we trust the results that are coming from country Y? But if you have a trusted framework under an established, body, a credible body, industry body that has been used by governments over the years, then that could be a meaningful way of addressing these particular issues. Now, the final point, just to wrap up, again, speaking to the point that was made by the Prof, by Geoffrey, is that the balance, my personal view, and I guess our view in IATA and across a large part of the industry, is that striking and finding a balance between saving lives and saving livelihoods is really a way forward. And I want to use the African example. I mentioned earlier that African Union is taking this approach, saving lives and livelihoods. And we're working together, again, with WHO, with the African CDC, and the wider industry, ICAO, IATA, UNWTO, and so on. So it's a real stakeholder coalition that's looking at this issue and saying, look, many of our countries are dying off. Economically, people just simply cannot sustain themselves. Yes, it's true. The virus is there, and it is even, it's really a big risk for people. But so far, we haven't seen the high numbers that we've seen in other regions happening in many parts of Africa. Again, there's a debate about whether we're testing enough and so on. But there really is a real concern that if we're not able to reopen borders, that we really will create other challenges that might be even as grave as the COVID in themselves. For example, poverty and people actually dying out of hunger. So yeah, I think I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thanks, Funke. If I were to press you, see the issue, and I think the underlying message from both Geoffrey and Suzanne were about the need to understand governments' need to protect, if you want, their communities, and testing, as you point out, is one of the ways you recommend before people travel in. But if you look at then your rejection of quarantines, I was intrigued. On 2nd of December, IATA issued a press release which basically called on Europeans and UK governments to immediately abolish passenger quarantines on the basis of an EASA and European Centre of Disease Prevention and Control rejection of transmission of using quarantines. But it was only in the context where transmission of the virus is already widespread. It's not a kind of a fitting all the scenarios. But if you look at, I'm based in Singapore, like yesterday, Singapore had 0 locally transmitted cases, but it had 12 imported cases, 2 of whom were symptomatic, 10 were asymptomatic. And all those 12 were placed in isolation upon arrival. So you can imagine why and how governments are concerned and using, in a way, these protections of isolation and quarantines to try to protect their population from further infection. And I think the other question you posed just now, and I think it's an interesting one, it's a very interesting, almost moral debate as to balancing economic impact and infection impact, so to speak. It's whether you protect wealth or well-being, jobs or health. And in that, I'm going to quote you something which and I'd like to get the panel's response on that. If I can just find this quote. Yes, because see, in the context of today, especially we're dealing with the pandemic, and even more so in the new normal, where skepticism is at its height, I think trust, you must agree, Funke, is a key to building confidence, and that public and private international organizations involved in travel and tourism must demonstrate their trustworthiness and not their vested interests. Now, I'll give you a quote, actually 2 quotes from the UNWTO Secretary General, who called, and I quote, "finding the right balance between public health concerns and supporting a sector upon which millions of people depend," end of quote. And a further statement, and I quote, that governments have a duty to put the health of their citizens first. However, they also have the responsibility to protect businesses and livelihoods. For too long and in too many places, the emphasis has overly focused on the former, and we are now paying the price, end of quote. How do you react to this kind of statements, Geoffrey?
Well, I'm really glad you reframed the question and put it in those terms. I hadn't seen Zurab's quote, but I think it is indicative and understandable of a mindset which is there to support the sector. And that's just a good thing and a necessary thing. But in my view, and maybe it's because I'm one step removed at the moment, I come down on the side of the precautionary approach. If you assume that your alternatives between health and the economy, to put it in those terms, is in a line, I have a start which is very close to the health position. Make sure that people are not going to die, and even more so, that people are not going to inadvertently kill other people because they're carrying the disease in ways that, you know, you said it's asymptomatic. You don't know that you're carrying it, but you've got it and you've been tested, but the test doesn't show for a certain while. Governments have to primarily protect against that. That's their responsibility. Yes, they have to be concerned about sectors of the economy, every sector, but their principal concern for most governments is the health of their citizens. Quarantines, which is where you started this discussion, is a blunt instrument, but it's something that governments can do quickly, and it demonstrates also to the citizens the seriousness of the situation. So I'm not surprised when governments put quarantines in. I'm not surprised when industry bodies ask for quarantines to be eliminated. And I don't think it's a question of getting the right balance. I think you have to keep moving this needle away from the health only from a precautionary view when you're certain that the actions of any sector are not going to make the health situation worse. And you said that a key to the position, you shifted into the position of the trust of the organizations. I think there's another element in all of this, and it's the trust of the public, of the system. When Funky said we had all these alphabet organizations together, so we had all the stakeholders, but you didn't. You had the group of stakeholders who are directly interested. You did not have consumer or NGO or any of those people who might have raised the difficult question. You had people who all wanted the same thing. And I've been part of the organization of that in IATA, very much in IATA. The whole IATA-ICAO relationship was built up in my days. I was responsible for that development. So I understand it. But in this current situation, and particularly when you can turn on your computer or your television set and you can see what's happening everywhere, I think you have to go beyond what you've defined as trust. I think people are looking for three things. I jotted them down. The first and overriding thing is safety. That's the most important. And I think in those circumstances, whether you're quarantining or whether you're having corridors or bubbles, safety has to be paramount. The second thing is, and here is a big issue that's coming up, is simplicity. If you have to travel between 3 countries and you need 3 different health certificates, and they can change the conditions whilst you're on your journey, that's going to drive people bonkers. And the last one is certainty. You don't want to be in a situation where you travel to another country and maybe you don't have quarantine when you get to that country. You find that when you go home, you have to have quarantine at home. So I think, I don't have a magic solution to what I've just defined. I think, but we didn't have a magic solution in 1940 to another 5 years of war. We're in for a tough time whilst we're juggling all these dynamics around and getting it to work, a bit like trying to get the multilateral system together, Funky, in IATA, when you're dealing with dozens of bilaterals. This is going to be a complex situation. And yes, hopefully the vaccine will make a big difference. But we also have to take the hype out of the vaccine, the Donald Trump bullshit out of the vaccine. we getting the vaccine to a situation where all of the population who might travel have had some sort of certainty in their control of the infection, that's going to take quite a long time. And I think the industry is going to be except for those people who are carrying the vaccine around, FedEx and UPS, if they're your members, Funky, they're going to do okay next year.
Okay, thanks, Geoffrey. Funke, can I ask you to make maybe a quick 1 or 2 minute takeaways from this discussion, and then we'll move
Sure.
straight into the environmental section of our discussion. Please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, this is a very interesting debate, and I think it's one that can be polarizing, but also I think that if it's addressed in a holistic manner, really can bring a lot of issues together. I think the one thing I want to say is that while we're having this discussion, I'd like us to just put on the table that it's not either or. All of these things we're saying, it should not be binary. And we're at the moment, I feel like we're having quite binary positions on these issues. The situation is that for every country, for every region, things are different. I've mentioned to you already in Africa that Corona is killing less people than hunger is. That's something that is a reality on a day-to-day basis for millions of the 1.3 billion people in Africa. So this is something that governments are looking at and really considering and addressing how best to look at the situation. I think, Geoffrey made a point about risk assessment, and I think that's really where I want to end my comments on this. If we're having a zero risk conversation, I understand totally. Keep borders closed, keep everyone at home, and let's just make sure that even one person doesn't get Corona. Totally understood. And it's a very hard decision for governments to make. The people who are making these decisions is very, very hard. In my country, I'm close to the presidential task force that's working on this. It's literally a balancing, very, very delicate balancing act that they go through every week. What is the status? What can we do? Can we increase the number of flights in? Can we increase the number of passengers in? Yes, we can here. No, we cannot there. That's really literally how it is on almost a daily, weekly basis. However, this conversation cannot be a zero risk conversation because there is no zero risk with Corona until we have proven the efficacy of the vaccine. I'm sure many of us on the call took vaccines as young children. I remember taking, as a young child, the yellow fever vaccine. Until today, I can travel to many countries in Africa with my yellow fever card that's renewed on a regular basis because I have been vaccinated. That makes it easy for me to go to travel around because I am immune to that particular disease. Today, there's no immunity against coronavirus. We haven't yet tested the efficacy. And so with that in mind, and that only, there is no zero risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Funke. And I think we all agree here. I think no government and nobody on this panel also is advocating a zero risk approach, whether dealing with airline aviation security, safety, or COVID management. I think it's all a question of whether the risks are sufficiently and adequately mitigated in the light of the known science and the known spread of a fast changing virus. And I think definitely we do not envy governments who have to make those tough decisions moving forward in terms of how do they best protect their population against unwanted risks going forward. But let me now turn to the environment in the 15, 20 minutes we have left. Now, before COVID, we all know aviation was one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions. The EU even noting that if global aviation was a country, it would rank in the top 10 for greenhouse gas emissions. Now with COVID and the mass grounding of aircraft, CO2 emissions from aviation reduced, according to Global Carbon Project, by up to 60%. Now at the IATA AGM last month, airlines reiterated the industry's commitment to carbon neutral growth from the start of 2021, with ICAO's Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, CORSIA, to cut net emissions to half 2005 levels by 2050, and to explore pathways to zero net emissions by 2060-65. Now, IATA adopted CORSIA in 2016 to complement a broader basket of measures to achieve global aspirational goal of carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards. Now, interesting to note that the participation of CORSIA, of course, is voluntary in the pilot and the first phase, which is from 2021 to 2026, whilst the second phase from 2027 to 2035 applies to all member states except the exempted ones. The exempted ones are either states whose individual share of international aviation activities in RTKs, revenue ton kilometers, in year 2018 is below 0.5% of total RTKs, and states that are not part of the list of states that account for 90% of total RTKs when sorted from the highest to the lowest amount of individual RTKs. Also excluded are least developed countries, small island developing states, landlocked developing countries, regardless of their share of aviation RTKs. Now, airlines were to use international flight emissions for 2019 and 2020 to create the baseline to show the excesses which would be offset as from 2021 to achieve this carbon neutral growth. But in July, ICAO decided to remove the unexpectedly low 2020 figures and rely solely on the much higher 2019 emissions data. Now, many green aviation groups have criticized offsetting as a means for companies to shirk their environmental responsibilities, essentially paying their way to continue business as usual and avoid any meaningful action on net emissions reductions. Greenpeace said, and I quote, "This whole strategy is a flight of fancy. Carbon offsetting is simply an excuse to carry on with business as usual, whilst shifting the responsibility to cut emissions to someone else, somewhere else, and some other time. It's greenwash, pure and simple, and ministers should be wary of lending it any credibility," end of quote. Susan, will the pre-COVID CORSIA and the aviation sector, and here not talking only about the airlines, the whole aviation sector, manufacturers, fuel suppliers, airlines, be able to withstand the enhanced environmental challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Vijay. And look, I mean, the good thing about CORSIA was that it did bring all the airlines or countries to the table to say, okay, we've got to address climate change as an industry. So that's the good one. On the other hand, I mean, it's not just Greenpeace, but just last week, the UNEP emission gap report came out and quite clearly stating that essentially the same point that you just read from Greenpeace, that CORSIA is completely inadequate. It does not lead to any reductions. And so in some ways, and you want a candid discussion here, I think it's probably dead before it starts. And I think what the progressive airlines are doing, and there's quite a group of them, they are really starting to push much harder on the real decarbonization of the industry. And so the World Resource Institute will bring out a science-based target approach for airlines that will come out in February. And that will provide a clear pathway for airlines to reduce emissions, essentially not net, but zero by 2050, because the net is an accounting construct. You can only have a net if someone else says your credit. If everyone else has reduced, there's no credits left to buy. So there's only zero at that point. So I think some airlines are pushing ahead. Some countries are co-investing, like some Scandinavian countries who work with the airlines. And I think that will in some way supersede CORSIA. And there might remain a voluntary carbon offsetting market, which is great. Great for those people who feel they want to make a donation and contribution. I can see that continue alongside some of the other sort of fastening pace.
Thank you very much. Funke?
Yeah, thanks, Vijay. I think it's a great point that I've just heard, in terms of the initiatives that are taking place and this, working towards science-based metrics for the airlines in terms of CO2 reduction. I just wanted to remind us, though, of what the aviation sector set out to do back in 2007 and what it's all premised upon. First of all, it was a proactive target setting, very ambitious target setting done by the aviation industry, and in 2007, when there was really a lot of attention on the aviation's impact on carbon emissions, on greenhouse gases. And of course, when this whole debate began, we stepped up to the table and said, look, we've got to do something. We've got to take responsibility. Never mind that we were, not maybe the highest on the list of emitters, but it didn't matter. We took responsibility. So what I want to remind us of is that there's 4 or 5 pillars that we're working towards. The CORSIA is the market-based measure that is supposed to be a way of, closing the gap outside of all of the giant strides that have already been made with technology, with operations, more efficient operations, with infrastructure, with sustainable aviation fuels in some cases, and so on. So there's already been quite a lot of progress that has been made. For example, fuel efficiency, one of the targets that you articulated earlier, we had set ourselves to, a target of 1.5%, and we're already doing much better than that as an industry. I think we're about 2.3% at the moment. Similarly, on technology, the aircraft manufacturers, all of the suppliers, everyone stepping up to the table and really making their own inroads and their own contribution, using different kinds of materials for manufacturing. Is not just about the engines, it's also what comes with an aircraft. How is an aircraft operated, the systems, how much paper do you put on it, how do you change what you use for serving the food. So many things, and not just the airlines themselves, but the whole ecosystem, green airports, waste management, and so on. So this is what, just a reminder that we started with this global market-based measure that evolved into CORSIA. And the importance of CORSIA is that it is a global measure so that we can avoid a multiplicity of regional schemes, which will, create quite a lot of chaos, confusion in some cases, and distort the market. And that's the reason why, under the umbrella of ICAO, the market-based measure came up. Now, of course, I understand that some regions are far advanced and really are quite active and proactive even in terms of addressing this critical issue, and are making a lot of great strides, like Europe, and that is to be commended. I believe that we are all working together to try to achieve the same goals, and I think that's really how we need to continue to think about this issue. Just a final point on what's been happening since the COVID hit. We've seen, we've had to address quite a number of concerns. One is that, even with the COVID, we maintain our focus, our laser focus on addressing our environmental challenges, and it is one of only of our 3 priorities for 2021. So environment is one of our 3 major priorities. So we maintain that. 2, we understand that it is something that is still forefront in the mind of the public. Going to something that Geoffrey had mentioned before, when we're talking about COVID, the public perception is still very important on this issue. It's not just the perception, but the fact that they see that we are doing a lot about this, and not just paying lip service to the issue. And the third is that some of the things that have arisen as a result of the COVID, for example, cabin waste from masks and other PPEs that are having to be worn, how we're managing that, single-use plastics on flights, and so on. And and the final point is that our key focus in terms of the pathway to achieving the zero net emissions that was mentioned by Susan by 2050 is really to aggressively target initiatives and really to move the needle on sustainable aviation fuel and on technology, particularly radical technologies.
Thank you very much, Funke. Geoffrey, can I ask you to respond or share your thoughts, but actually try to do it in 3 minutes?
Wow. Yes. a very quick one. First of all, when I was in IATA and responsible for amongst other things, for the regional activities, I wish I had had Funky there working for me, because you make a very good case. The challenge, and I think I don't want to appear to be too adversarial, because I'm a big fan of IATA, a big fan of the aviation system, but the ambition is Neanderthal. I repeat, Neanderthal. In 2005, Giovanni Bisignani created an advocacy system of 4 pillars. And they're the things you referred to, of which market-based mechanisms, technology, and they were very well defined. They were based on a work that Kevin Dobby did with McKinsey before that, just to talk about all of this. It was a strategy. And the strategy was, let's get out there ahead of the game. Let's get an ambition which is accepted by the whole of the group. And let's put that into the international framework, which is our protection, which is ICAO. And then you put somebody on every ICAO delegation, and then ICAO comes out with its own solution. Vijay, you were the chairman of the first big ICAO air transport conference. So and I was working with IATA doing exactly that. And IATA did this magnificently in the case of environment. They created ATAG, and ATAG produces brilliant papers, again, pulls all of the community together, puts out very good studies. But whilst IATA has been advocating for 10 years for an ambition which is half of 2005 pollution levels by 2050, the rest of the world's moved on. Whilst IATA has been working in ICAO outside of the Paris Agreement framework, President Xi of China says we're going to be zero carbon by 2060. The European Union says we're going to cut our emissions by 55% by 2030. And I think what's necessary now is for IATA, and it has a new Director General, be a great thing for him to do, to come in and say we've upped our ambitions. Airbus have announced that in 2035, they will be producing 3 variants of a no carbon aircraft. And sure as hell, between now and 2035, you can be sure that Boeing and Embraer and everybody else will be coming out with their variants of the same thing. So my message in this last 3 minutes, it's one, Vijay, I gave to the Arab Air Carriers President's Assembly in 2015 when I gave an address to them, and in the ICAO address that I gave, the Qatar lecture that I gave last year. The airline should get on board with the rest of the international community and declare a 2050 zero carbon ambition. And yes, we know the challenges of sustainable aviation fuel. We know the challenges of being able to operate in many, many different regimes, but have a valid ambition and then work towards it. It changes the dynamics and it changes the mindset.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. I think it's a very interesting note, but I think my takeaway from this discussion here is that we really, the aviation sector needs to update its climate commitments, because what was agreed to before COVID must be aligned to this new normal, and recognize that there are increasing calls out there to move beyond net zero, to regenerate. So the world is moving on, and I would agree with Geoffrey there that actually, as friends of the aviation sector, we would wish that sector to actually revisit its commitments and effectively try to align it with the new expectations out there. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I promise you a 1-hour discussion. I hope you had the benefits of all these incredible insights of people who are very passionate about our sector, who are very articulate, very enthusiastic, and I know you would want to continue engaging with them, and we wish them well as they actually take these ideas across. And I would like, on your behalf, to thank Funke, Suzanne, and Geoffrey and all of you for having joined in. The key message I would like to leave you with is that the travel and tourism stakeholders cannot and must not act recklessly in this COVID world, or simply wait and hope for a return to the pre-COVID world. We must wake up to the fact that the new normal requires new mindsets to find new solutions. Beyond innovation and digitalization, there's an ever-growing need to create a safe, secure, and more socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable travel and tourism model, which is driven by values. Nobody knows how all this will play out, but we must all do our trustworthy best to rebuild confidence in the safety, security, predictability, and positive community value of travel and tourism. Thank you very much, and over to you, Geoffrey. Jürgen.
You read Thomas, don't you? Yes.
It doesn't. Thank you very much, guys. So this was absolutely excellent, and I really wanted to thank all of you for participating, especially Vijay, who has been working on it hard. And I'm looking forward to working with you, Vijay, and the Aviation Interest Group more. We're ready, and I think our members and our supporters and our viewers are very interested in being part of it, and at least to follow the development. I wanted also to remind everyone, tomorrow we have 3 sessions. Just go to WTN.travel, click on the blue lounge event banner or on the red menu item, WTN Lounge and Expo, and you can easily sign up. If you're not a member yet of World Tourism Network, just go to WTN.travel, click on Join WTN.travel, and we would be happy to add your profile to our list of now a little bit more than 1,000 members worldwide. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching us. And from all of us, good night from Hawaii. Good morning to you, or good afternoon, wherever you are, and aloha. Bye-bye.